The summit is aimed at finding ways to address the scourge of femicide and women abuse in the country. ENC reporter Masego Rahlaga attended the summit and joins us now. Thanks very much for coming through, Masego. Some really horrific testimonies today at the summit.
It was a lot to take in today at the summit. About 10 women spoke. Of course, we know of Griselda Grootboom. Her story has been told quite a number of times. She was actually pimped by a friend. She was from the Eastern Cape. Her friend promised her a job when she came here, and unfortunately, she was then trafficked. But of course, there were other women who told us very horrific story. For instance, there's Avela Faya, who told us about how her mother was murdered, Vuyo. But we do have a bite from her in terms of what she said about what happened to her 11 years ago and how she lost her mother. And here's what she said.
I was affected by femicide at the age of 14. Approximately 11 years ago, I lost my mother at the hands of my adopted brother. He and a group of friends broke into our home. My 7-month pregnant mother was sleeping in her room with my uncle sleeping in the next room. They broke into the house, first suffocated my uncle to death, and then they proceeded to my mother's room. 1, demanding money, and 2, we later learned they were there for her body part. My mom was ripped open while she was still alive, and the baby was removed from her body. She was later cut to pieces, mutilated, in other words, until there were no limbs.
Of course, I mean, the president, the speaker of the National Assembly, ministers, senior members of the judiciary, all arms of the state, had representatives sitting there and listening to these horror stories. There obviously is a point to the summit. What is it? What is it that they want this summit to do?
Although the statistics show themselves, South Africa is actually quite a violent country. A lot of women are passing away or being killed by their own partners, people that tell them that they love them. And, in many of the incidents, the women are trustworthy of these people. They let them in their homes, etc. And so, what the government has promised is something that, feminists have been asking for years. There's been a lot of such summits. It's probably not a presidential summit, but there's been a lot of such summits that have been held in previous years. But the statistics just keep on rising. I mean, Stats SA released statistics that said that the women who died, who are killed by men rose by 53% in 24 months back in between 2015 and 2017. It's very scary statistics, Vuyo, but also there's a specific woman that I just wanted to tell you about, Martha Marumo, who actually admitted to being in prison for murdering her husband back in 2003. And she says this is because she had endured a lot of violence from her husband, abusive behavior from her husband for a couple of years, and all the law enforcement agencies that she approached for some help, all the doors that she knocked on, nobody was helping her. People were instead trying to convince her not to get a divorce, to try and sort it out at home. Police were laughing at her, and she just basically walked around with like her head hanging in shame because she didn't know what to do. And so, of course, when she was escorted, she's serving a life sentence at the Kgosimampuru prison in Pretoria. And when she walked out, this is what happened. Some of the activists actually called for her to be released. So, Vuyo, over there, Martha Marumo, she's serving a life sentence. She was sentenced in 2005. And, you know, the activists believe that she should be released because she's a victim of abuse, and she actually took the law into her own hands because nobody was there for her. So these are the types of stories that we were listening to today. And, of course, there were even lawyers who were actually giving her their cards to ask her to contact them, maybe to ask them for help.
It could just be something that they can do. Is there something that members of Cyril Ramaphosa's executive promised to do? You had there, we're seeing now, the Minister of Justice and Correctional Services. You had the Minister responsible for women in the presidency. Did she say anything?
Well, the woman responsible the minister responsible for women in the presidency, Mebathabile Dlamini, I asked her specifically, Vuyo, about, you know, the worry that this could be just another meeting amongst people in government, and then it could just go away after that, nothing could change, and, you know, the risk of all of that, because we've seen in many years that there's a lot of talk and no action. How is there political will, actually, for you know, government to actually implement all the policies that they're promising to actually put in place for this scourge to be eradicated? They promised, for instance, things like training police to become better at you know, not sending away the victims of crime, to ask them to go speak to their husbands, for instance, and sort it out at home. For instance, they also said that they would have more training in the justice system to see what it is that they can do not to re-victimize the victim. You know, the line of questioning that happens in courts when victims are telling their stories of either rape or witness of crimes of that nature. But of course, you know, one of the women actually, she even said, you know, how many centimeters? And we all know where that came from. She said, how many centimeters? But she used that phrase to say, how many centimeters is the political will to actually implement all these things that you're promising us? Are you going to implement these things, or are we just going to see the statistics continue rising? But of course, I also asked Minister Bathabile Dlamini about the obvious case of that 20% liability that she was found by the Constitutional Court in terms of, you know, the money that happened, that SASSA debacle last year and the year before. And this is what the minister said. Minister, I wouldn't be doing my job as a journalist if I didn't ask you this question. The Constitutional Court, of course, you know, that judgment that came out, 20% liable. Have you started paying any of that money? This is with the SASSA debacle, ma'am, when you were still the Social Development Minister.
No comment.
And some people would say, would you be stepping down like the Minister of Finance, maybe, who stepped down earlier?
No comment.
No comment. That's
no comment, Masako. Thanks very much for coming through, Masako Ratla.